I wanted to introduce and welcome the chair for this second session, which will provide a platform to discuss lessons learned from the JSDF experience in working with civil society organization. We apologize for having a men-only panel, but I think that is contrasting with the previous panel, which was all female, so I think we have a good balance there. And let me then introduce the chair, Cyprien Fissy, who is a director for social development, who will chair the panel and lead the discussion to come forth. But let me also give just the name of the panelists. We start with John Garrison, who is a senior communication officer in EXT. We have Mirza Jahani, CEO of the Aga Khan Foundation. We also have Shibuya Hiro Nubo, who is from the CEO of the Save the Children Japan, where we met before. And also, I wanted to welcome Danilo Sonko, President and CEO of the Finoy Foundation for the Philippines, and then Dan Owen, the Senior Social Development Specialist in ECA. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, the Chair. The other condition he did not mention is that with part of this panel, your hair must be graying. So you see different shades of gray around the table here. And that's it. So we're going to expect a lot of wisdom from the members around this table. But to start that process, we're going to introduce ourselves briefly. And I'm going to call on the panel members to give a big background, where they come from, what they do. And I'll start with myself. As they pointed out a moment ago, my name is Cyprien Fissy. I'm the Sector Director for Social Development at the bank. John, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah, John Garrison. I worked for a number of NGOs, government agencies, church agencies before I joined the bank some 15 years ago. I spent 5 years in Brazil working more in the operational area. Now I'm working the global civil society team here in the bank that carries out more the relationship management, the outreach work that the bank does with global civil society.
I'm Mirza Jahani, the CEO of the Aga Khan Foundation USA. I've shared my career, which spans about 25 years, hence the grey hair, between the British government, Department for International Development, and the Aga Khan Development Network. So I've seen the work of civil society from the two sides of the development community.
Great.
Your turn.
Well, it's me, huh? Trying to get the mic on, please.
I'm not going to introduce myself because apparently my office sent a very extensive bio. I'm slightly embarrassed about it. So you can take a look at it. I am CEO of the Save the Children. My name is Hiro Shibuya. I couldn't hold the job long enough, so I was in the civil society sector for the first time. I was on the board of many NGOs, but it's the first time the last 4 or 5 years working with Save the Children. And I find it fascinating. I've been in business. I was a UN bureaucrat, and I served as a consultant to World Bank and Central Asia for a while. So I have my own perspective about how the World Bank relationship with civil society has evolved the last 25 years. So we shall see where we go.
Great, great. Nice.
Yes, my name is Dan Sonko. I work with the Pinoy Foundation, which stands for Filipino Microenterprise Foundation. It's a foundation that was started by former President Cory Aquino to help grow the microfinance sector in the Philippines. I'm no longer involved with the organization that was a beneficiary of the JSDF, but I was with that organization called Code NGO for about 9 years. And so I did a lot of networking for civil society in the Philippines.
I'm Dan Owen. I'm in the social development unit in the ECA region now. But in my previous incarnation, I was coordinator of the bank-wide community-driven development group and involved in a number of JSDF projects. In this room, there's the Sierra Leone Gobifo project. And if you haven't yet filled in your ballot papers, you might want to put number 20 down there.
Well, campaigning at this point is not allowed, but we're going to go straight into the session. What we want to do during this session is to look very clearly and look at 3 core areas to get a sense How do you achieve development impact at the grassroots level, working with civil society groups? And what does that mean in terms of work we do? The second area I'm going to focus on as part of this discussion is to understand better how we deal with issues of sustainability and scale up. How do you sustain these activities if they are done by civil society activities? And what are the patterns for sustainability going? And thirdly, is the broad area around accountability. How do you provide accountability of different civil society groups, and how do we try to tease that out in the context of this discussion? But before we go into the discussion, there is a 10-minute video that will help frame the issues in the context of JSDF. So let's watch the video before we go into the discussion.
One of the key objectives of the Japan Social Development Fund was to work with and build the capacity of civil society organizations. The study that we've undertaken aimed to look at the success of the Japan Social Development Fund's work with civil society organizations. And in order to do this, we also looked at the broader context of the bank's work with civil society. The bank works with civil society at the global level in consultations on policy and strategy. It works with civil society organizations at the country level, again consulting with civil society on country level policies, country strategies. And also there is a lot of work that is done by civil society organizations that is indirectly financed by the World Bank. A lot of lending, for example, for social funds and for community-driven development involves implementation by civil societies, even though it is the governments that are the borrowers. But we were focusing specifically on situations where the bank is giving grants directly to CSOs. And one of the first objectives that we had was to try and quantify the role of JSDF compared to other bank direct grant giving to civil society organizations. This had never been effectively done before, but we were able to assemble the data that showed that overall the bank probably gives in the order of $60 million a year in grants to CSOs. The largest number of grants comes from the Civil Society Fund, very small grants to very large numbers of CSOs at country level. However, the largest source of grants to civil society organizations is the Development Grants Facility. The second largest is the Japan Social Development Fund. We looked at JSDF's experience from both a quantitative and a qualitative point of view. As JSDF has now given over 220 grants to governments and civil society organizations, we had a large database on which to work. And we analyzed the quantitative experience of grants given to CSOs compared with the quantitative experience of grants that have gone to governments. And about 40% of all grants have been direct to civil society organizations. Perhaps to our surprise, we found that civil society organizations disperse more of a grant on average than governments. We found that civil society organizations disperse slightly faster than governments on average. There wasn't a lot of difference, but certainly in terms of efficiency, CSOs are at least as efficient as governments when it comes to disbursement. We also compared the ratings that civil society organization implemented grants achieve. As you know, the bank rates all activities, both on project implementation and on achievement of development objectives. And we found that the average ratings for civil society implemented grants are significantly higher, both for project implementation and for achievement of development objectives. We were initially quite surprised at this because we hear all sorts of anecdotal stories of problems with civil society implemented grants. But then when we sat down and thought about it, actually we hear quite a lot of anecdotes about government implemented grants as well. And clearly, on balance, civil society organizations are actually more effective as implementing agencies than grants to governments. On the qualitative side, we interviewed very large numbers of stakeholders in Japanese, in JSDF grants, but also in the broader field of grant giving to CSOs. We interviewed stakeholders in Washington, we interviewed stakeholders by telephone or video conference in a number of countries, and we carried out field visits to the Philippines and Indonesia to look at JSDF and bank experience with CSOs more generally. And in addition, we took 8 case studies. These were not randomly selected. These were quite deliberately selected as being case studies of projects where a priori we were told that these were very successful projects. So what we looked at in these 8 case studies was why were they successful, and was the received wisdom that they were successful actually correct? And in some cases they weren't quite as successful as we were told at the beginning, but in general all 8 were successful projects. So the conclusions that we've drawn from this study resulted from quite a wide range of different analyses, and we reached a number of key conclusions. Firstly, the Japan Social Development Fund is by far the largest donor-funded program giving grants to civil society organizations. It is by far the largest World Bank Trust Fund giving grants to CSOs for operational work. It's unique in its focus on marginalized and disadvantaged groups. It's unique in its focus on innovation. This was very heavily emphasized to us by bank task managers who said there's no other program that does this. It's unique in its focus on community level work. And it's unique in its focus on civil society capacity building, as opposed to just working with civil society as partners. But that doesn't mean that every relationship with a civil society organization will be a success. JSDF projects are risky, and if you take risks, you can't expect that you will always be successful. Secondly, civil society organizations often need capacity building inputs, and the more successful grants to CSOs recognized that from the beginning and included capacity building activities for the partner organizations. Thirdly, not all civil society organizations are appropriate partners, and we came across a number of examples where the initial choice of partner didn't work. Fourthly, civil society organizations need to be familiar with the location and the discipline they're working in order to be effective partners. And one has to remember that there are reputational risks not only for the bank in working with civil society, but also for civil society organizations in working with the bank. So what recommendations did we come up with? We came up with quite a number of recommendations for the future, not just for JSDF, but for the bank working with civil society organizations. Firstly, given the overall success of CSOs, we strongly recommend that the bank continues to work with civil society organizations as partners for implementing community-level projects. We strongly recommend that civil societies be selected which are familiar with the locations they're going to be working in and which are familiar with the disciplines in which they're going to be working. We recommend that civil society organizations be selected as partners, especially in risky environments, post-conflict environments, post-disaster environments, where they clearly have been shown to have a comparative advantage. We also recommend that civil societies be recommended where there are innovations to be tested, because it was clear to us that civil society organizations often have a much higher risk appetite, and they're prepared to take risks that governments, for good reasons, are not prepared to take. And similarly, for the bank, giving grants allows you to take higher risks than you can take in a lending environment. We recommend that the bank works with civil society organizations in contexts where there are shared objectives and shared commitment to the project. We also recommend that wherever possible, the bank should use a competitive process for selecting which CSOs to work with. This doesn't necessarily mean going through all the rigors of AMS 15, the bank process that is set up for normal procurement. But it does mean trying to make sure that different civil society organizations' potential is examined in a particular context before selecting particular partners. It's important to recognize that all civil society organizations are not equal, and that in some countries accreditation systems have been set up to distinguish, if you like, the sheep from the goats. And we strongly recommend that if accreditation systems exist, they should be used. If accreditation systems don't exist, then it's worth JSDF supporting the establishment of accreditation systems. There have been some very good examples of this. For example, one of the case studies that we looked at in the Philippines. And providing accreditation systems are designed appropriately, they should be used. We also recommend that there are certain situations in which it may be less appropriate to use CSOs. We looked at a number of projects which are on what you might call the advocacy implementation interface. And in certain circumstances where CSOs are really in an advocacy role, it may not be appropriate for them to be receiving JSDF grants. And this can, again, as I mentioned earlier, raise reputational risks for the CSOs as well as for the bank. Lastly, we recommend that JSDF looks at simplification, harmonization, acceleration of processes. This is particularly important for civil society organizations, which need to have easy bank processes to work with. Thank you.
Results are very compelling, and it raised a number of issues which I wanted to let the panel comment on. First, there was a very strong mode of engagement where the bank has to engage with civil society groups to achieve results on the ground, especially in the context of the JSDF. The key for us is also to have our other partners, the government. And the government was basically missing from this discussion. Under what circumstances and to what extent should governments also work with civil society to achieve results on the ground? Because here we hear the bank engaging with civil society. What's the role of government and under what circumstances would they engage with and work with civil societies to achieve results on the ground? Shall I start with you, John?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, first let me just say I think that this study is very significant because, as David said, the author, the lead author on this said, this is the first time that the bank has looked across the institution to see all the different funding mechanisms that fund CSOs, and they came up with 26 different funds. And also the amount they came up with, $60 million a year, is very significant because we had estimated that maybe it was about $30 million, so it's double the amount. And just a word before I speak about government, I think it's very important. Of course, CSOs get a lot of funding from the bank through the CDD, through social funds that goes through government ministries. That's the big portion of funding of civil society. But it's also very important, I think, and I think the CSOs here would agree, that we have a direct relationship with CSOs, and that's why this study shows how important it is and all the lessons learned. The fact that government is important, and I think governments actually receive more funding from JSDF than CSOs did directly, and a lot of these funds that went through governments ended up in the hands of community groups as well. But so I think there's an important distinction of the study of showing the direct and the indirect routes that civil society has benefited from grant financing.
Isao?
Yeah, I think that for me, the role of government is absolutely vital if we are going to be successful in the process of development. I think much of what we heard about this morning, much of the experience that the Aga Khan network has had with JSDF, as well as other NGO programs, indicates that there is a certain ceiling that one can reach when one continues to follow just the civil society approach in isolation of government. And therefore, the question for me coming out of this study is, yes, we need to do a lot more work with civil society. There's not enough resources for civil society, particularly on attacking the demand side of the service provision of government agencies. But we cannot burden poor communities entirely with the cost of providing these services. And that's where government will have to enter the arena. The question, of course, is how does government enter the arena? Does government itself also utilize the capacity of civil society in its own country? Or does it try and provide the services by itself? And the experience everywhere around the world is that when government outsources to civil society, there's greater efficiencies and effectiveness of the programs. I mean, I think in India, I don't have the statistics at the top of my head, but maybe somebody else does in the audience. But in India, a huge amount of resources, government resources, flow through civil society organizations. So I think for me, that's a very important point that you put on the table. And I would want us to think about that as JSDF or the World Bank generally starts to think, well, what next? What are the next generation of projects in this arena that we need to put forward?
Thanks. Subiya-san?
Yeah, we're not supposed to be promoting a particular project that an organization is involved in. But I have to say, in the context of what we talked about, our early childhood project in Vietnam was a classic case prototype where actually three sectors, World Bank and Save the Children as a CSO, and the government. And not only does the national government through Ministry of Education and Training, but also the local government and also local communities are all involved, and really an equal partnership. I think that exemplified how the philosophy of JSDF work. I have to say, in terms of involving those three sectors, and I think ultimately, I think there's a private sector part, the good old crusade of private-public partnership here. But I think we have to recognize each sector has its own governance, and each offers a challenge to be transparent and accountable for what they do, how they do. And sometimes I don't think we quite have yet learned those three sectors have a different way of governance and exercise of transparency. If we master that, I think the partnership of those three sectors will work much more smoothly. And I must tell you, as a critic often of a Japanese development policy, JSDF is a really exceptional, creative one, and I venture to say to you, now that we are doing this at the World Bank headquarters, I think the argument and the promotion about the viability of JSDF in a context of a World Bank relationship with civil society has to be shared by other members of the World Bank community. I think that's very important, because after all of us are here as probably converts already, and we need to propagate this valuable relationship and how we can really capitalize on this to other members of the World Bank community.
Great. Dan?
I think the way you might want to look at the division of labor, one way you can look at the division of labor between government and civil society in development is that civil society is really a lot better in terms of innovation, and government's role is really to scale up. Rightly so, because I think CSOs are more flexible, they have more creative, and government does not have quite the kind of talents, and the bureaucracy is usually concerned with following the rules, and then bureaucrats are always usually saddled with a lot of those rules. But what the NGOs do not have are the capacities, the bureaucracy, and the resources to scale up the very good innovations that they undertake. So if you look at the different projects that we have here, they certainly are very, very innovative. But I think the challenge really is to what extent can you scale them up with the resources, the limited resources, and the limited capacities that CSOs have. And I think that's where government comes in.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, adding on in one unified Dan voice aside of the panel, maybe let me refer to the Sierra Leone project, because I think when we went in, the sort of genesis of that, of the GoBoFo project in Sierra Leone, was to work in the poorest districts in the country and provide very rapid service interventions in communities. This is post-conflict, with a lot of communities in the process of rebuilding, of coming together with refugees returning. And there was a lot of discussion about where to place the implementer of the project, if it should be outside government as an independent civil society organization. The decision at the end was to put it inside as a quasi-NGO within the local government ministry that was responsible for decentralization. And one part of this is the concern about scaling up, but I think before that there's an immediate concern with sustainability, that if you're working in isolated communities, particularly on health and education, a lot of rehabilitation of schools, of clinics, the key issue here was your one project, your grant, will expire, and what happens to the service, to continual sustainable service provision beyond the confines of that particular project. It's not an easy relationship, and I think, again, I mean, there are other interests here. One was on the extent to which you can use the grant to really influence policy, and again, that might be easier if you're inside. So I think it requires a blended approach, that at some point you have to harness the power of all of different agencies.
Great. I hear issues of sustainability and scale up. I'm not going to go there now. I'm going to come back to your idea about governance of the sectors. Just to get a sense, how do you construct the governance of civil society organizations in ways that you have transparency and accountability in that system? Part of the challenge has always been they are not that transparent in their own governance. How would you frame that issue?
Yeah, well, in fact, I involved with your inspection panel people about that subject in about a year ago. And I did say that in a public statement. In fact, civil society organization probably are challenged to be build a much stronger governance and transparency. It's simple, because there's no, when you're stepping in accountability, we are only accountable to people who support us. The government, ostensibly in a democracy, but being people have selected and elected officials, and they do that, so that the government is accountable to people, and private sector is accountable to shareholders. But CSO is, in one sense, not accountable to anyone, but on the other side, therefore, CSO is accountable to everyone, because we were a group of people who come to form organization to do something, and therefore we have to be more vigilant about our own governance. We do appreciate what you are, I think, referring to. But as I was saying initially, the CSO looks at the World Bank, particularly in the field office, is a sort of a too high a hurdle for NGO to approach. That is not just a perception, in some ways in reality. This is why I think JSDF is a great inducement for the field office World Bank to really in a tangible way to build a partnership with CSO, whether it's international, the field offices of international NGOs or indigenous NGO, whatever the case may be. But really looking at the realistically, you remember the Indonesian cases. Mm-hmm. There is the former finance minister and managing director of the bank now, and there was a nanny, and there is the real person who actually does the business. And there was a nanny's critical role to facilitate this big hurdle into reality of what the actions are. And I think CSO, I think David was alluding to, there's different types of CSO, bad ones and good ones, and big ones and small ones, different types of CSO. I think among the CSO, we should develop a special kind of role to facilitate partnership building with a big institution like a World Bank. I do tend to also ask World Bank field offices to be more engaged in field CSO activities, so that project that could be funded by JSDF come to Horizon, that would facilitate the process.
Great. Let me thank you, Dan Sonko, because in the Philippines, they have done a lot to vet out CSO groups and to provide accountability in the system. Can you share with the audience what you have done differently to ensure that at least those NGOs that engage or civil society groups are those who work for on behalf of the people?
Well, the way we try to do that, Cyprian, is we established a certification system. We call it the Philippine Council for NGO Certification, I think about 12 years ago. I was part of the group that founded the PCNC. And the idea was to, well, this is a bad word for NGOs, right? To determine, to accredit the good ones and the bad ones. Not in that context, but I guess in the context of those that are more accountable and are willing to subject themselves to accountability measures. And that was what the certification system was all about. The good thing about this system is that it is recognized by government. I think it's one of the very few accountability or certification systems in the world by CSOs that's recognized by government, in the sense that certified NGOs in the Philippines are eligible to get tax-exempt money from donor companies. And it's worked both ways, in the sense that, yes, we were able to successfully identify or certify now about close to 1,000 CSOs. On the other hand, there's also a still much larger CSO community in the Philippines that did not find any incentive, I guess, for themselves to get certified. So essentially, the certification system is all about incentives. You're able to use it as a way to determine who are more accountable. But the ones who do not bother with accountability are always looking for an incentive of, why do I have to go through this process and what do I have to get out of it? So it's really a balance of setting up that system and providing the incentives for the NGOs to be able to use the system.
If I add one more, the caution on the certification by the government, the criterion for certifying NGOs, we have to be very sensitive, we have to be very objective, because certification criteria is such that would dilute the independent nature of civil society. Is defeating its own purpose. Just want to add to that.
Correct. Let me thank you, Ms. Sao. Just to the same question of accountability. How would you enhance accountability of civil society organizations in their engagement with development partners?
Okay, I mean, I would talk about it sort of broader than just the World Bank partners. I think when we look at accountability, we increasingly need to look at it more than just a linear accountability. I think the accountability in the modern world is a lot more diffused. And certainly at the Aga Khan Development Network, a key stakeholder for accountability are the beneficiaries themselves. And you must have structures and systems that allow the beneficiaries to hold you accountable. The reason why I say that we need to look at it in more diffused ways, I think you have to have multiple stakeholders holding CSOs accountable in multiple different ways. And I think that's where, again, the World Bank could be extremely valuable because of the credentials you bring to the table for holding civil society organizations accountable. I think it's a very valuable service that you provide. And I would encourage the bank to do even more than 300 projects with civil society organizations, and probably does do a lot more, as David Potton's very good documentary was suggesting. But I think that it has to be looked at, accountability has to be looked at in multiple different ways. And with new technology and internet, I think the time is gone for any civil society organization to get away by being not transparent.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Let me thank you, Dan. You mentioned issues of sustainability of some of these investments, and they need to scale up, not only in terms of projects, but in terms of policy. Given the examples we have from the JSDF, to what extent have we provided a framework for scaling up and influencing policy?
I think the combination of work on both asset creation and work on improving local governance is the key entry point. Where you have particularly sort of isolated communities where relationships of trust have broken down, where there's very little confidence in government services and government action. There's a local relationship, which I think is the beginning. It's a stepping stone, the foundation to entry into a much vaster arena of policy and programs. It's certainly been the case. I could also think of Sao Tome, where we were working on trying to build up civil society capacity to work as a counterpoint, but also a partner and a counterpoint for better access to health and education services. So for me, those two go hand in hand. That you can do a lot of work through the JSDF on local action, and there's a very heavy emphasis, I think, in the program on demonstrable results, on actual results at the grassroots. But to do those in isolation without having a demonstration effect of them being able to influence how services are provided or policy is programmed, I think is missing a tremendous opportunity.
What do you think, John?
Well, I mean, I think the issue of scaling up of bank funding of CSOs has always been a challenge for the bank because unlike a bilateral agency like USAID or JICA or DFID, where a government makes a decision, well, we're going to fund our own CSOs, we're going to fund developing country CSOs. The bank, of course, we're governed by 187 countries. And so the decision is much harder to reach to say, well, from now on, we are going to scale up funding of civil society directly. And also you have governments that may not be very familiar with their own civil societies or even not comfortable in their relationship with their own civil societies. So it makes it more difficult for the bank to make that institutional decision to really scale up. I mean, I think this study, as I said before, is significant because it shows that already we're dispersing $60 million a year to civil society directly. But to go beyond that, to skilling that really up, it's going to be a slow process. My own view is that I think we will scale up eventually, where we will see civil society as a greater partner. Governments will always be our main partner. They're our owners and what we call our clients. But I think civil society organizations will become more and more partners as well through direct funding.
Great. Let me turn to you, Miza. And just to get a sense, you mentioned earlier on the demand side and trying to strengthen voice. How do we frame the demand side in ways that you advocate and do advocacy and at the same time do service delivery?
Yes.
Well, because there's an inherent tension between that element of advocacy and service delivery at the same time. How are you trying to deal with that in the Aga Khan Foundation?
And primarily, the Aga Khan network is about service delivery to the poor and to provide quality services in an affordable way to a large number of people in different countries. For us, the question of accountability and service delivery can be put together. And I'll explain how. I mean, I think you will have heard of citizen scorecards, and I'm sure many of your colleagues in the bank will have come across them and done some work on them. It's basically saying that all action, all government action, ultimately is about services. Even if it's security and safety and defense, it's still a service. And the clients for that service are the citizens. And like everywhere else, if the clients can actually get a service that they want and they can actually demand that service, then you have an accountability mechanism. There are a number of ways that we have tried: voucher schemes, cash to the people, giving people a greater choice, citizen scorecards, bringing local government together with civil society organizations to agree what are the standards and what are the expectations of both sides, and then measure that outcome. So for us, accountability starts there rather than, I mean, if you mean by advocacy, just general demand for improvements in government and reform, we tend to do less of that. We are much more tied to the nuts and bolts of, better immunization, better healthcare, better classroom, better headmaster performance. Those are the sorts of things that we do quite well. And I think there we have found a lot of improvements happen when you give people a bit more of a voice. And that's what I was getting at when I was talking about the demand side.
Great, great. I'm mindful of the time because I want to give the audience occasion to ask questions to the panel, but I'm going to turn to you, Dan, and ask another important question where we see an inherent tension between what they call international NGOs, who have a broad base, who can network well, and their outreach is so overwhelming that they can influence policies even here at the bank, and then local NGOs and people's organization. And there tends to be a disconnect between these different groups. How do you try to frame issues that will link the international to the local and to the national in ways that you have some coherence in the system?
Well, I think that's what you might call a creative tension between the international and the local NGOs, where there's always a struggle between who is able to frame the issues correctly and more efficiently. And I think often in terms of accessing funds, it's the local NGOs that are left behind, because the international NGOs are more savvy in raising funds. I think the dialogue mechanism is very important in the sense that the international NGOs have the facility to define macro perspectives, frame issues in macro perspectives, and connect the issues to organizations like the World Bank and other multilateral institutions. But when you come to the local level, it's really the local NGOs that have a greater feel and sense of the realities on the ground. So these are two very important perspectives that need to be taken together. And like I said, it's really a creative tension between how you can manage, how you can balance between which perspective needs to come together and how this will come together, particularly when you get to the issue of funding. Like who gets the money, how much of the money is going to be divided, and who is accountable for the monies that are accessed. I think these are the gray areas in those relationships.
Shubi Hassan, I see you nodding. Do you have something to add?
Yeah, this is, now I'm going to be promoting a Save the Children course, because in a way, Save the Children is not a typical international NGO as you would define it, because there's no international headquarters who's dictating. The Save the Children is consistent of 29 members. Each organization has its own governance and has a board. So we work together. This is what precisely happened in Vietnam. That project was shared by Save the Children US, Save the Children UK, Save the Children Japan, equally. And I think the international NGOs are now going through transformation. The paradigm shift, the whole global dynamic changing, we have to be embedded in the field, as you pointed out. And I think Save the Children, in a sense, is in a better place because from the beginning, we are now already, and 5 years ago, we started the unifying offices and field offices. And some of the our main objective is to help create a national civil society organization using the capacity we have, access we have. And that's the kind of role that international NGO must play and obligated to be relevant in the future.
Great. Let me ask one last question to the panel, and then I'll open up to the floor. But I'm going to focus on the issue of capacity building. What the JSDF has done very well is to help build capacity of CSOs to engage and to deliver services and to do things at a local level. But in most of our learning instruments, governments don't want to help build capacity of CSOs in their countries. So there's never scope to do that. How would you then think through if we're going to engage differently in terms of our loans and learning programs with local governments? How would you put in place a framework to build the capacity of CSOs? Let me start with you, John.
Yeah, well, I'll be short on that. I mean, I think one of the conclusions from the study was exactly that the JSDF should help with accreditation programs that CSOs are developing for themselves. So I think that's a good place to start. But I think joint training the bank has been promoting that a bit, of government and CSOs and donor agencies together, the officials together on capacity building would be a good way to start, because that way you also build trust in the process.
Mila?
I think that's the toughest question that you pose, because I've come across many good civil society organizations which are struggling and are losing some of their best talent because they're not able to pay salaries, just like all of us need salaries. So do civil society organizations in the developing world. So I've been challenged both at DFID and at the Aga Khan Network in trying to support local organizations long enough so they are sustainable, that they have the capacity to hold their own governments accountable. I don't think we're can put our hands on our hearts and say, we've done the job. I think we are nowhere near creating a significant amount of civil society, a significant number of civil society organizations in the developing world. I think we're a long way away from it. And one of my pet subjects is that every international leader in every speech will say civil society is important. The next morning when you ask that person, or whenever you get the opportunity to ask people in that person's institution, because I don't meet the leaders of these institutions, why aren't you supporting civil society? There's always some sort of an excuse about not being able to support civil society core funds. We are quite happy to fund women, water, and trees. But when it comes to accountants, financial systems, or boards, or management systems of civil society organizations, how many of us, I'm as an international development officer, I've cringed at that. But without that, capacity is a hollow ambition. And that's my worry, and that's my struggle. I think one slight sliver of hope that we've got is through philanthropic organizations in their own countries. So, for example, the Aga Khan Development Network sponsored the development of Pakistan Center for Philanthropy, which is saying to Pakistanis themselves, you need to build your own civil society through philanthropic action. In Kenya, we supported the Kenya Community Development Foundation, which was another recipient of JSDF funding, but it hasn't reached the lofty heights of one of these boards. But it's another example of how Kenyans are supporting their own civil society. And I think that's one hope that's out there. And anything that the World Bank can do to pursue this a bit more, I would certainly be delighted.
Thanks. Subiya-san?
Well, the au crochet localization, Save the Children is now our ultimate objective or change that we are now instituting is to create Save the Children and in the field run by leadership of that particular countries. Save the Children, India already now board is the Indians, executive director is the Indians, and so forth. Vietnam is a classic case. We still call it Save the Children in Vietnam, Save the Children in Nepal. Our effort is taking in out of that equation so that we have a genuine national leadership taking over. I think that the international NGOs, as we now speak, is slightly old concept. And the growth and the success is blinding us from really to trying to change ourselves to meet the 21st century need of development dynamic, which has to be bottom up, not from New York or London, but rather from where the actions are building up to it. I don't think we have quite to figure that out. And if we come to that, then we have a really genuinely strong capacity building process at the national level with a combination of international capacity of international NGO together with the local strength.
Great. Dan?
Well, my view is that I think the challenge in when you talk about capacity building is really we always look at capacity building as the great leveler. You know, it levels capacities, but it can also be a means of control and a means of condescension. Yeah? So the one building the capacity of a lower form always has the power, right? So to me, the question ultimately is capacity building for whom and capacity building for what? Because there are also instances where you see NGOs getting capacitated and beginning to look condescendingly on government agencies or government people because they believe they are now better, they're more competent. We have gone through all of these capacity building exercises. So I think I like the idea of John, and I think that's the way it should go. Capacity building always has to be a tripartite or a system where you build capacities together, not building capacity to a lower form where you try to assert your dominance over the ones you're building capacity of.
Thanks. Dr. Dan?
I think, I mean, in some ways, I feel we're our own worst enemy here because we've often thought about capacity development as a project cost and not as a project investment. And that's certainly in the case of Sierra Leone, where the whole grant was structured around building capacity to enrich social capital. The idea was that the capacity building, the needs were widespread, and it wasn't, the focus was very much on local communities, but understanding that partner agencies, civil society, government, both centrally and locally, there were plenty of capacity deficiencies. Understanding that as an investment, because we wouldn't get to a point where you can translate social capital into financial capital, of empowering local people, local communities to really take control of their own destinies and development, and improving livelihoods, which was, I think, ultimately I mean, in many of these places, it was the end. You want to raise incomes, you raise welfare. The capacity wasn't conceived as a separate activity. It was a continuum, and I think it's been successful in that context. It's challenging elsewhere. One of the countries I'm working in now, a traditional World Bank lending instrument, they do not want to borrow money for capacity building. We can think about trying to change the names, change the labels.
Thanks. Let's open up to the audience. I mean, please introduce yourself, or say where you come from, and be very concise. Let's get questions from the audience. Yes. Please use the mic.
Sure. Thank you. My name is Maurice Kofa. I'm from the Africa Environmental Watch. I just returned from Liberia a week ago, and I want to reference to the gentleman. Are your name Daniel Owen? Yes. Mr. Owen, thank you very much. Sierra Leone is very close to Liberia, and the whole region been out of war for 14 years. They have destroyed the entire region. And we just have Ivory Coast just plunged into another conflict, which of course bringing in refugees into Liberia. My question here, we talk about civil society. One of the biggest problems that we experience in the region specifically is the issue of capacitating or sustaining whatever that is being put in place. My question to the panel, how can JSFD or the World Bank ensure civil society to effectively function, to build themselves when government have a stake, or most of the civil society are microcosm of the government? Because what I have experienced in the region is that civil society cannot work effectively independently, because these government, the government that are there, have some leverage on them. And if they are not doing what they want them to do, they have the capacity to strangulate whatever funding is coming to them. What can be put in place in terms of mechanism to ensure that civil society function effectively, receive the funding, and use it wisely to their own discretion?
Thanks. Let's get more questions from the audience. I can't see. No. Any other question? Yes, sir. And then the lady behind.
Yes, hello. My name is Alvaro Restrepo. I come from Colombia, and I'm one of the beneficiaries of the JSDF projects. And this morning, I heard some of the experiences that were showcased here, and I had a question that's always coming to my mind. I've been working in this country where you know that there has been this ongoing non-declared civil war for the past 50 years. And we have the worst humanitarian crisis of the Western Hemisphere with almost 5 million internal refugees in our territory. Okay. And we are working in the Caribbean coast of my country in Colombia, in a city where we have a large population of internal refugees, and we have 70% of the population living below poverty line. 700,000 people living in misery in a city where 1 million inhabitants live. And I always think that institutions like the World Bank, I've had this experience for the past 4 years working with the World Bank, and we're always thinking about the poorest and working for the poor. But my concern now, after all these years of work and of experience, is that I believe, like Brazilian pedagogue Paulo Freire, who spoke about the necessity of not only liberating the oppressed, but to liberate the oppressor. And for me, it's very important that the efforts are directed not only to take care, I think that we would be so much more effective educating those who cause the problems than just taking care of the victims. So for me, my question is if there is a lot of effort put also on the education of the policymakers, on the education of the people who have the possibility of changing people's lives. I remember once an ambassador coming to my project. We were going to start building our new site, and he came and he looked at our architectural project and he said, "It is too ambitious for a city where people are dying of hunger." So we're always thinking about poor projects for the poor and not thinking that the poor deserve exactly more because they are poor.
Thank you, sir. The lady behind there.
Could you define how you're defining civil society? Nigeria may be an exception, but it's a very vibrant civil society environment. And if you really look at the contributions of civil society to their own existence and their own agenda, much of that is contributed by the civil society groups themselves. And when I say that, it sounds like we're not talking about the wide range of non-state actors, the church, professional associations that generate their own resources, set their own agendas, are defiant in terms of their independence and their relationship with government. And if you could, anyone comment on the importance of nurturing those relationships or simply allowing them to just exist and thrive on their own.
Thanks. Any other question from the audience? If there is none, let me come back to the panel first. And Dan, do you want to start with a question on Sierra Leone?
Sure. In fact, I think there's a connection. First two questions, but about the freedom for civil society organisations to operate effectively. It also, I think, links back to the discussion, the question about accountability and instilling demand for accountability and responsiveness through these activities. My sense is that a very obvious way to tackle this is to have very clear oversight, and that oversight can be quite broad. Certainly, where you want to harmonise or not allow for a battle between potential government policy and the local operations of civil society. Very simple mechanisms to bring civil society, government, private sector together. I mean, this is certainly worked in Sierra Leone, where you have very effective local oversight, including the media, actually, which has been an extremely important governance insertion, and having a grievance redress mechanism in these programs where I mean, one very effective way was involving community radio, local radio, very, very quickly getting information out, having that information accessible to everyone, and having very simple rules of the game, those procedures. I think part of the problem is when things get lost in the complexity of different programs having different methodologies and approaches and procedures. And that can allow for, I think, a great deal of competition. But I would say, you know, the key point here is building in a very good sort of lesson dissemination plan into these programs, and making sure that information gets out and gets disseminated.
I think part of his challenge was that most of these groups, which call themselves civil society organizations, have also been captured by the administration. So you don't know which one, who talks for whom. And that process itself tends to distort accountability.
Right, and so sorry, one last point here, and again, this is sort of been referred to in the panel, but the a very obvious starting point in determining the appropriate sort of civil society is within the community, and this is, I think, for the Liberia work in Sierra Leone, a very similar context in an enormous sort of a panoply of different perceptions of organizations that were, on the face of it, supposed to be helping rebuild communities, and very varying degrees of confidence and trust. Some organizations that have been either, it's the traditional, the white elephant, or actually making matters worse, and very poorly governed. So I think getting back to a sort of an involvement of your communities, your engaged communities, in demanding accountability and providing some sort of interface, I think, is a key ingredient.
Great. Ms. Do you want to take the question on Colombia?
Yeah, I mean, I can take the question on Colombia. I think like Daniel was saying, there, 1 and 2 are connected, and maybe even 3. And the word that we haven't used all day today is leadership. And I think the Colombian question is really asking us to think about leadership in both civil society and in government. And I'm sure a lot of us have come around to the fact that many of the problems out there are because of inadequate leadership. And where does good leadership come from? And is it a question of educating bad leaders now, as the Colombian question was asking? Or is it something that we should have started doing a long time ago? Or is it something that we should start doing now so that in 20 years' time, we have got leaders that we do like? So I mean, at the Aga Khan Network, we look very hard at the education systems that we support and that we work with. And we are increasingly looking at tertiary education at university level. The bank people will know that we want to create an Aga Khan University in East Africa, based in Arusha. And the point there is, where do the young African leaders come from? And if they're not good leaders, if they're not being trained as we do in the West, then we're always going to have a problem of educating bad leaders. I think that Paulo Freire had got it right. Educate the oppressor as well as those oppressed. And that's what I would suggest we ought to think hard about. The quality of our education systems, the quality of the leaders that are coming out of that system, and what can we do now to ensure that we don't have the same problem in the future. That would be my thoughts.
John?
Yeah, let me just also add to what you had said. Having grown up in Brazil and been involved in the popular education movement, the Freire, that philosophy, I very much agree with that philosophy as well. And I think the bank, we're an organization, I can't say we're the oppressors, but many do. But we certainly do work with those in power, with the political elites, right? And we work with the financial elites because we work with large and medium-sized companies through the IFC. And I've been at the bank for 15 years, and I think we are speaking to the elites of these countries, very much so through our reform movements, through the governance reform, anti-corruption, safeguards, HIV/AIDS, working with civil society. Many governments are often very skeptical with our approach to working with civil society. Many of our governments may find this report unsettling to see how much we are funding civil society. So I think it's a good investment for civil society to work with the bank. I know we're oftentimes hard to work with because we're more bureaucratic perhaps, or it's harder to get funding from us than it is from a bilateral or from even a local government agency that you may have good relations with, say the Ministry of the Environment or something like that. But with working with the bank, engaging the bank, you're getting the ear also of the political and financial elites in these countries. So we do believe in working with not only the oppressed, but with the oppressors as well.
Do you want to take the question on definition of CSO?
Yeah, just quickly on that. I mean, the definition that's in the report that JSDF has is the definition we have at the World Bank, which is very broad-based. Basically, everything that is not governmental or not for profit, the third sector, is what we consider civil society today, and that does include faith-based organizations, professional associations, social movements, foundations, and others.
Great. Dan, do you want to add anything?
Well, I guess the only thing I can add is in terms of the role of CSOs is to also begin to look at the definition of roles between CSOs and government. I think we often find CSOs wanting to do everything themselves and wanting to be empowered and taking on the role of government. I mean, this is in an ideal democratic world, because I understand that in an authoritarian system, the tensions are very much different. But I guess in an environment where dialogue is possible, a definition of where are the boundaries of what NGOs can do and should do, and where does government come in, is, I think, something that needs to be constantly harnessed. Because otherwise, there's a lot of expectation from NGOs of being able to get the resources, get themselves empowered, help the community, without realizing that there are things that government can better do than them, and there are ways by which resources can be leveraged by NGOs with government and vice versa.
We can take two last questions from the floor, if there are any, before we wrap up. Since I see nothing coming from the floor, let me ask one last question, which we have not discussed, but around the whole issue of regulation, because there's a tendency now for some of these groups or for governments to want to regulate civil society, and sometimes the regulation itself is a problem. Let me hear from the panel the question of regulation of civil society and how we approach that. Do you want to start, Dan?
No, not exactly.
This other Dan then.
Well, I think the best way to approach this is from a self-regulatory way by which NGOs need to learn to regulate themselves if they don't want government to regulate them. Now, that's easier said than done, I understand. But that's why, I guess in the Philippines, the experience of self-regulation has reached a point where we're beginning to ask ourselves, if we're regulating ourselves, then how do we know that we are successful in regulating ourselves, and if we are really performing that function? There's something that we tried with Philippine Center for Philippine Council for NGO Certification, which was funded by the JSDF, which is instituting a public accountability system of NGOs, meaning that the general public is challenged to report if they know of any of the certified NGOs that are violating their certifications, for them to come forward and report them to PCNC. And PCNC would go through a process of determining whether indeed those NGOs are guilty, and if they are, then their certification is removed. It's quite a challenge, because while the system is ideal and it brings accountability to a very advanced level, we realize that the NGOs themselves in PCNC were against it at the beginning, because they were saying, what if someone is just wants to give me a hard time and reports a case against me? So how do you determine whether these processes are really fair? So I guess the challenge of self-regulation is really upon the NGOs themselves. The best way for me, and especially in the experience that I have gone through, is if you don't want government to regulate you, you must be prepared to regulate yourselves.
Shubir Hassan?
Well, I'm not going to be popular in saying this, but, let's not have an illusion about this, that I'm, 192 members of the United Nations, and, you cannot have a Jeffersonian liberal governments on 122 countries there. There's a lot of problems, one kind or another. I think one other sector, when we talk about this whole development and dealing with the poverty too, if I may dare suggest that the involvement of the private sector. And I don't think we have a monopoly, government on one hand, and as a public sector and NGO. There's another player, which I think is going to be increasingly more important, and it should be, has always been important, is the private sector, the business sector involved. Some of the CSO always think that partnering with the business is some kind of, Another thing is to the extent that information technology is providing us is opening the flow of information. The transparency and dynamics is not as a result of a democratization of a global governments, governments in the world, but rather people have access to information. Therefore, they have a much more power to either to challenge the government or, for that matter, the role of the private sector in exploiting in natural resources and so forth to be accountable. I think that's another thing. We got to look at the positive end of as well as the negative one. I think development of information technology, whereby people in developing countries, even the poor people, have access to information is a very powerful tool. Knowledge is always powerful to have a stakeholder accountable to whatever happens to them.
Thanks. Let me give the last word to you, Misa.
I think that I don't have much to add in terms of the regulation ideas. I think, yes, a consensus, an agreement with government, with international partners, what it is that you actually want to ensure compliance with. For me, there's another question, if I may use my time to ask another question, which is not to be addressed right away, but all today we've been talking about the idea of mainstreaming and scaling up. And a question has emerged in my mind about these experience of JSDF for the World Bank. What does it tell the bank about mainstreaming work in civil society? From DFID's point of view, we would make trust funds available to the bank, and the bank would want to use trust funds in order to do work of the type that JSDF is doing. And I've always asked myself, why doesn't the bank do more of it with its own resources? If it's good, if it's creating great impact, and if, as David's report says, that we should do more, then what's stopping the bank mainstreaming much more of its work into this? I know there are 101 answers to it.
There are.
But I wanted to use my time to ask the question.
And it's an important question as a segue for us to wrap this session, because it's been extremely productive. What the JSDF has done, which is quite unique, is to create the space to try to engage with and work with civil society in ways that are innovative. Because the initial intent of the fund was to introduce innovation, and by engaging civil society, trying to test issues at a local level, test new ideas at a local level, and then bring them to scale has been a major achievement of the JSDF. If you look at those programs that have grown significantly, the JSDF has been catalytic in trying to make this happen. I think your question is very well taken. Why are we therefore not mainstreaming our engagement with civil society? But bear in mind that our partners in development and the instruments we have require that you engage with some of the governments who themselves might not necessarily want that level of engagement to take loans in order to fund those activities, even though it might be constructive. That's why the three-party dimension, working with government, civil society, and international communities, is an important one going forward. And at the end of the day, the challenge for us is then to see how then we will put in place mechanisms for sustainability, and how then do we link them to local governance mechanisms in ways that at least those initiatives, which are initiated at a local level, get sustained in the system. And finally, how then do we provide accountability? And as part of this challenge, it became very clear that there are mechanisms for self-regulation, how then you engage with different partners to do that, mindful of the fact that you may have very strong international NGOs who tend to engage with and dominate local NGOs. So it's been a very productive session, and I think the bank is learning from the whole process. So I want us to give a hand to the panel for a job well done, please. And let me hand it over